Broadcasting from the Cass Corridor in Detroit, it's the Metro, WDET's daily news and culture show. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Today on the program, in our changing economy, how vital is home ownership for economic mobility?
We'll look at trends in renting and home ownership in Metro Detroit and nationwide.
And we want to know, do you own a home or do you rent? And do you have a dream to own, or maybe not?
We'll reflect on what the American dream means today and talk to some housing experts and take your calls.
Plus, some nasty illnesses are sneaking around Metro Detroit. We'll sit down with an infectious disease doctor for all the info.
But first, if you want to get somewhere fast, efficiently, and cheaply, there's only one answer: a car. Going up north for camping or to Grand Rapids for the weekend doesn't require a car. Technically, you could take Amtrak, a bus, or even fly, but all of those options are less efficient, more expensive, or both. So yeah, having a car makes travel easier.
It does, Tia, but what if we Michiganders invested our money differently? What if we were to put it toward passenger rail, train cars that went from Detroit all the way up to Traverse City? That project isn't a reality, but the study to make it happen has moved to the second phase, which makes it closer to becoming a possibility. To discuss that possibility, what's happened thus far, and what more needs to happen to make passenger rail a possibility, we have Michael Goldman Brown here. He's the transportation specialist with Groundwork Center. That's a nonprofit studying the possibility of passenger rail between Detroit and Traverse City. It also facilitates collaborations between different interest groups that are trying to make this project happen. Michael, welcome to the Metro.
Good morning, Tia and Robin. And first of all, thank you for having me on to speak about this today.
So you're now in phase 2 of this project. In phase 1, you did a feasibility study to see if passenger rail was even something that could eventually become a reality between Traverse City and Detroit. And you found that there is the possibility of that. What did you learn during that phase?
Yes, indeed. We learned a lot, but the operative or key learning would be that if the proposed service was fully developed as proposed, it would cover its operating costs and that its economic benefits would substantially exceed its capital and operating costs. And we found that to be a statement in specific support of the feasibility of the project. So we've forged ahead onto this phase 2, which is a much more comprehensive study, as you alluded to.
Can you talk about some of those economic benefits?
Absolutely. So first of all, we're talking about lowering congestion and lowering the amount of pollutants that are going to be in our communities and our downtown areas. Further, we're looking at benefits that create a more convenient travel experience for people. The main demographics that were discovered in our feasibility study and that are being looked at in this phase 2 study are business travelers, medical travelers, students, and leisure travelers. And for each of those groups, we see a train as creating a better passenger experience and a more streamlined and perhaps quick experience.
Medical travelers, that stands out to me. What does that mean?
That would be largely people from communities north of Ann Arbor, so Howell, Mount Pleasant, Alma, Clare, Cadillac, Petoskey, Kalkaska, Traverse City. People who have medical appointments where the hospitals don't have all the capacities in the rural or northern areas of Michigan. So they come down for procedures in Ann Arbor, Detroit, Grand Rapids.
So that's providing a really crucial service then for folks in rural areas. I just wonder if I could ask you, Michael, what do you like about riding a train?
For me personally, it's about the relaxation and not having to be in control of your own personal vehicle, or if you're not in control of the personal vehicle, being in a sort of cramped experience. You can get up and walk around. The windows tend to have phenomenal views. You can do work, and it just tends to be convenient and calming.
You're right. It is very convenient and calming and quite the contrast to air travel. Uh, so I'm definitely team train here. Now, the rail already exists between Detroit and Traverse City. So what are the biggest obstacles to getting passenger rail done between those two places if there is already an existing track?
Yeah, so first of all, with the airport, it absolutely is a much more convenient option than flying, as you don't have to deal with security or the hassle of getting to the airport an hour and a half or longer before your flight. But getting at the fact that the tracks are already in place, they're also largely owned by MDOT and through MDOT, the state of Michigan. So the largest impediments to getting train service in operation would be funding and improvements to the current tracks, which are requisite on funding.
Okay, so MDOT, Michigan Department of Transportation, owns the rail lines. That's unique, isn't it? I mean, what makes Amtrak expensive around the country is that other freight companies own the lines. And so this is great news. Essentially, all we would have to do is invest more money in the Michigan Department of Transportation then to make this happen. Is that right?
Essentially, yes. Expanding their capacity for handling our state's rail operations and giving them a mandate to actually fund improvements for this line and operate it.
Okay, but there are some political obstacles to getting this done. There's now a public transit caucus in Lansing. People said in Traverse City and northern Michigan communities that they want to be better connected to southern Michigan. But it has me wondering who in the state doesn't want to see this project happen.
That is a good question. Largely, it would tend to be, I'd say, a reaction to the perception of the cost. Um, that's really the main objection that people have. And our response to that would be that roads are also very expensive, and so are airports. And of course, we expect roads and airports to be well maintained and always available because that's really what we've gotten used to. But building and maintaining rail is much cheaper than highways on a per mile basis. Some estimates suggest it can be 50% or more than cheaper to maintain than a road. And we really need greater investment in public transportation, especially here in Metro Detroit, where maintaining our roads is prohibitively expensive and the wear and tear, well, every ounce of wear and tear that we can get off of those roads means less that we're spending on them.
So it costs about half as much by your estimate to be maintaining a rail and everything that goes into it. That sounds like a pretty a slam dunk, essentially. So it has me wondering, is this, when it comes to the divide, is this a Democrat versus Republican thing, or is this a bipartisan supported idea right now?
We would say it's a bipartisan supported idea. Our funding from the state, the funding to conduct this phase two study came from both the federal government, $1.3 million from the U.S. Department of Transportation, and another $1 million from Michigan's Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. And the grant from the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity was heavily supported by a Traverse City based senator who is a Republican. And we also see opportunities around the country with other Republicans. Roger Wicker and Trent Lott of Mississippi, they're both senators, and they've been incredible proponents of Amtrak expansion in the Southeast United States, or yeah, that would be the Southeast United States. And we've even seen representatives like Elise Stefanik in New York writing letters demanding answers on why track improvement projects are coming along slowly and stating that Amtrak is a vital connection for the communities that she serves. So we
Okay.
really see a lot of emphasis on the importance of rail and Amtrak across the aisle.
Now, you've mentioned multiple grants. I'm wondering also if Michiganders, if this would show up in the income taxes that people pay to the state.
Um, it When you say that, you mean would the funding for the line come up in their income taxes or the funding for these studies?
For the line.
Potentially. We're also looking at unique funding models that would perhaps look more outside the public spending, more private models. That's still up in the air. Our engineering firm that's looking into the phase two study is specifically looking at funding options and developing those strategies. So that's something that we'll see more about as the study comes along.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. We're talking with Michael Goldman Brown, transportation specialist with Groundwork Center. He's discussing what his organization is doing to try to make passenger rail happen between Detroit and Traverse City. Now, Michael, during phase 3, there's an environmental study. How long do you think it will take to study, and what needs to be done to make passenger rail happen between Traverse City and Detroit?
We're hopeful that that would be an abridged or shorter process than the typical environmental analysis, as the tracks are already in existence. They're looking at a few years for that environmental analysis. Hopefully, it could be quicker than that. Really going back to what's required for the trains to actually start rolling on this line in the Traverse City, Petoskey, Cadillac, Mount Pleasant, the towns along the line. It's really that funding to end up increasing the amount of funding that we're providing and giving them a mandate to operate the line, or it could potentially come from some combination of a private operator, someone similar to Brightline, but that's still being determined.
And when we talk about rails and the maintenance of rails, what environmental factors does the analysis take into account?
Really, it's looking at endangered species along the line, impact on the local vegetation and environment. Really, it's making sure that there's not going to be adverse environmental impacts from the project. And fortunately, as the tracks are in place, it looks like that could be a much shorter process than typically.
And you've talked a little bit about funding just a little earlier. Exactly how much money are we talking about here? How much money would be needed to make passenger rail happen between down south and up north, for example?
For the least expensive option from the original 2018 feasibility study, we were looking at around $150 million for a 60-mile-per-hour service.
Wow. So quite a lot of money there. And when we think about everything that we've been talking about, why should we all have this at all? I think many people would say, hey, we have cars. They're great. They're efficient. They're doing what I need them to do every day. Why do we need train travel at all?
I think that the biggest catalyst for it is that, well, it's attractive in many ways. It brings young people and people who are old businesses who are interested in attracting young people and talented people to work on their operations. We especially saw that when we spoke with or companies that are involved in Ann Arbor Spark. There is a lot of excitement, and when they can tell that to a prospective employee that there's going to be more train service or train service to somewhere like Traverse City and Petoskey, that piques people's interest. And beyond that, it's simply about providing another option for people. And when we look at the city of Detroit, the Detroit Regional Chamber has stated that around 30% of Detroiters don't drive, and more people are foregoing driving by the year, especially young people. When we look at driver's license, the rates at which young people are obtaining driver's licenses, it's going down on a yearly basis. And if you want to be a region and a city that's competitive in the modern economy, and attracting people and growing as we're trying to grow Michigan and the city of Detroit and all of our cities, you have to have options that are attracting people.
And, listening to you say that my nieces are younger, I have young nieces and nephews, they have no license, no driver's license. They are of driving age, but they have no driver's license. So it's very interesting to see how that's changing. So how do we approach the change culturally to embrace train travel and public transit in general?
I think it really starts with with improving the options that we have and developing so that we can actually get places within our state. When we look at our current Michigan rail services, they're all kind of oriented around Chicago. The Pure Marquette goes from Grand Rapids to Chicago. The Blue Water goes from Port Huron to Chicago. And The Wolverine goes from Pontiac to Chicago via Detroit and Ann Arbor and a few other cities. Um, and all of the timetables are scheduled around Chicago. When we look at making a system for Michigan that helps get Michiganders around our state up north and also out to our west coast from Detroit and Pontiac and Ann Arbor out to Grand Rapids, really it takes a sort of reconfiguration of the way that we're looking at our rail services right now.
Michael Goldman Brown is a transportation specialist with Groundwork Center. He's trying to make passenger train travel happen between Traverse City and Detroit. Michael, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
From the WDET newsroom. Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson says voters are telling her what they want from their next governor. She's been meeting with people across the state since the end of the 2024 election. Benson, whose term limited, would be considered a top contender if she seeks the Democratic Party nomination for governor, but she's not ready to announce her plans yet. Meanwhile, Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan has already announced his candidacy for governor. He's running as an independent, and that means he would not face Benson in a Democratic primary if she enters the race.
Coming up at 11, home prices surged during the pandemic and haven't come down, and this has made younger generations view homeownership differently. We're going to talk about how homeownership in Detroit and across America have changed, and we want to know what you think. What's your housing situation? Do you rent or do you own? Has buying a house always been a goal of yours? Why or why not? Give us a call, 313-577-1019.
Up next, there are some nasty illnesses making people sick around Metro Detroit. We'll get the latest and we'll learn about the rise of the avian flu. We'll be right back on the Metro. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. And this March will mark 5 years after the COVID-19 pandemic caused officials to shut the country down. While COVID is still out there are other viruses getting the attention of physicians, including norovirus and the H5N1 bird flu. On one hand, understanding the current viruses floating around Metro Detroit seems like a good thing for public health. But how much information is too much information? And when should we know to go home, or when should we know to wear a mask, or when should we know to go to the doctor? Dr. Tina Chopra is a professor of infectious diseases at Wayne State University. She's also an expert with the Center for Emergent and Infectious Diseases. Dr. Chopra, welcome back to the Metro.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So what are we dealing with right now in terms of illnesses? How much do we know about the avian flu, or H5N1, especially as it impacts Michigan?
So the avian influenza is spreading amongst from birds, from wild birds to a lot of our cattle, different animals, including cows and pigs and even domestic animals who have been in contact with either wild birds or other farm animals. It is causing a flu-like illness in the animals, and also it has spread from animals to humans and across 16 states. The only good news we have is that there is no human-to-human transmission at present, but we have seen mild cases of flu in humans, and also one severe case in out of Louisiana where the patient passed away. But avian influenza is a real concern. It causes flu-like illness and also causes conjunctivitis in those human cases that we have seen around the nation.
And just for clarification, conjunctivitis, what is that?
It is an infection in the eye where you see symptoms of red eye, you see a lot of congestion and burning in the eye, and it's an inflammation in the eye that we see as a part of the symptoms of avian influenza in humans.
So bird flu has been detected in Oakland County, and one person has been infected and multiple others are being monitored as we speak. What do you all know about the spread? Once again, you just talked a little bit. It hasn't been human to human just yet, but how are you all working in the medical field right now to prevent further spread in the state?
One of the things that we are doing at the Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases is developing our assay so that we can test for avian influenza. We are also monitoring if we have patients with some of these symptoms. We ask them the screening questions if they have had any contact with wild birds or animals who are sick, like cows. So we are making sure we do a lot of surveillance. At the same time, we are very vigilant about anybody having human-to-human transmissions, because that is the real concern. If the virus mutates and it has the capability of transmitting from one human to human, that can really bring us back to the old days of the pandemic.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was going to say. How afraid are we, or not afraid, but how prepared are you all for this thing to turn into something that could turn into a national outbreak or a pandemic again?
I think it's very important that there are more resources for farm workers, so they can help spread the disease in amongst animals. That is the part where all the resources need to be put into. But in general, we are preparing ourselves at the Center of Emerging Infectious Diseases at Wayne State. Along with my co-directors, we are developing an assay that can help us test, because once the assay is ready, and if there is, God forbid, human-to-human transmission, we can test thousands of people in a day. So we are also preparing ourselves by doing more surveillance and screening.
And, when we think about testing and figuring out what to test for and how to test for, especially this new avian flu, the H5N1 bird flu, do you all have to go through a new process when you're creating these tests? Is there a new criteria that you have to go through, or are you using old tests to bring into this new disease that you're trying to figure out? How are you guys developing these tests, especially when we talk about this new one?
So it is the same technique, but you develop a new test based on the main time-consuming part is validating your test, and that is what we are working on. But we use the same techniques that we have in place for influenza, we have in place for COVID, and we develop a new test for H5N1 and then validate our test.
And, if farm workers are hit the hardest, is this an equity issue in terms of the people who are most at risk? I'm thinking, for example, about undocumented people who might be doing this work.
That is a real concern. Farm workers are getting affected. And also, do we know if they have enough resources to help spread the disease in their animals, whether it is cows or other animals in the farm? So yes, there are disparities. There are social disparities in healthcare, which is important to focus on, and it's important to give them more resources so they can protect their animals and themselves from transmission.
And there has been one reported death from H5N1 that was in Louisiana, but the person had comorbidities, and were over the age of 65. So are we seeing the same age group being in risk, or the same risk groups here with the avian flu, or are we seeing it expanded out a little bit more? Or do we not know? Yeah,
so I think only time will tell, but like other viruses, every virus has one pattern. They cause infections in animals, in birds, and in birds it's usually a GI kind of an infection, and then when it spreads to humans, it is a respiratory infection, but just like SARS-CoV-2 or influenza. But people who have comorbid illnesses or older people are in general more likely to have severe consequences of the disease because of their age, because of which they cannot mount up the same antibody response as young adults can, and because of comorbid illnesses, which also limits their immunity. So this is a general rule for viral infections that older people and people with comorbid illnesses do tend to have more severe disease.
And moving just a little away from avian flu right now, bird flu, and moving towards other illnesses that are grappling Metro Detroiters right now, and that's norovirus. We've been hearing a lot about it through media channels and whatnot. So what is the norovirus and how is it spreading?
Sure. Norovirus causes a diarrheal illness. It causes severe dehydration in people because of nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. It is also highly contagious, and it's very important to wash your hands with soap and water if somebody has it, because it can easily spread to surfaces, and from surfaces it can spread to other people. And it only takes a few viral particles to cause disease. So that's why it is usually in the form of outbreaks. We are seeing outbreaks because transmission happens rapidly when you're not washing hands with soap and water, when you're not isolating yourself while you have the illness. It's very common in younger children. It's very common in older adults who have lower immunity. So the key is to wash your hands with soap and water.
And Dr. Chopra, can doctors test for norovirus?
Yes, there is a test for norovirus. We can easily test both in the clinical setting and in the hospital.
You're listening to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We're chatting with infectious disease specialist Dr. Tina Chopra about the latest illnesses making folks sick here in Metro Detroit. Dr. Chopra, some people lost trust with public health leaders during the COVID pandemic. Now with the pandemic behind us, but with so many other public health issues that persist, what are you and your colleagues in the public health world doing to try and gain back that trust?
The biggest thing is to be the trusted voice of your patients, of the community, and to be able to listen to them. Listening is a great quality that any leader can have, and that is what we are doing as part of the Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases. What is it? What are the concerns that our patients have? How can we address them? Whether it is inequity or social disparities or access to health care. Wayne State is also the leader in going to the patients and through their mobile clinics and helping overcome those inequities.
So those mobile clinics then are helping to address those disparities. And we're talking specifically about people of color who've been historically harmed by the medical system. What additional steps are you taking besides listening more deeply, which, of course, we know is really important?
We are also training the next generation of clinicians and healthcare workers to help overcome these disparities. We are serving our communities, going out in the community and doing community outreach events. We are doing train the trainer sessions. We are writing and publishing newsletters to share information and to debunk the myths out there about public health, about vaccines. And these are few ways in which we are helping. In addition, last but not the least, we are also very much engaged in state-of-the-art research to come up with newer ways to overcome these disparities.
How much do you think, Dr. Chopra, the COVID pandemic has affected or catalyzed some of these initiatives you're talking about now? And how has it changed the way that we're talking about illnesses like the ones we've discussed today?
Absolutely. I think the pandemic has made it very clear for our community, healthcare community, that we have a lot of work to do. It is not that our infrastructure is broken. I think it has made us aware of the disparities even more. We are more aware of those disparities, and we also are more aware of what are our high priority areas we need to work on. How can we help those who are under-resourced. And that is, I think, the strength of Wayne State being an urban university located in Detroit. That is our strength, that we cater to the underserved and we work towards making their lives better.
I want to stay on the topic of awareness for a moment, if we could, and apply it to the ways in which we're protecting ourselves. For example, I've talked to public health leaders who say they still wear masks out in public. I think about traveling to multiple different Asian countries where people are constantly wearing masks, and especially when they're feeling ill, to protect others. Should we have kept mask wearing?
So, masks are a tool in our toolbox. They have not completely gone away. People should have people will have to use their judgment to use the mask when they need to. And nobody can judge anybody for using a mask. If somebody is in a crowded area, they know that somebody is sick, they can wear a mask. They should wear a mask if they need to do it. So it should be a choice that we should give to our community. Masking is a choice, and there should be freedom to use it, whether you are going to travel, or you're going to be in a crowded setting, or you're going to be indoors in a smaller room where there are so many people. For example, I am working in the hospital and I am seeing a lot of sick people. It is my duty to wear, as a clinician, to wear a mask and protect my patients, my colleagues, and my family. So if I know that the mask is going to protect all three of them, I will wear a mask. Same way, washing your hands is a duty that we have towards public health.
But unlike hand washing, masks were politicized. I wonder how that made you feel as a public health leader.
They were. This is very unfortunate that they were politicized, and it is unfortunate that there is a lot of misinformation around it, around masking. But masks work. They help us protect when, especially in. You don't have to wear it all the time, but in the setting of outbreaks, or in the setting where your cases are surging, as just like now, our flu cases are surging, RSV cases are surging. So this is a good time to have that mask in your pocket and use it when you need to.
Dr. Chopra, before I let you go, I've heard from people this fall and now into the winter that it seems like viruses are just nastier, that they're just getting worse. Is that true? Are viruses like the flu and norovirus worse now? Did COVID do something to disrupt our immune systems? I'm wondering why it might seem like this to people.
No, it is not true. We are seeing exactly what we see every year. They were worse the year right after the pandemic in 2022, but this year we are seeing what is expected this time around in the year. So our RSV rates are what we expect every year. Our flu rates are what we expect every year. They are not worse. But yes, we are surging right now. People who are vaccinated have less severe symptoms than those who are not. So, for example, people who have had the flu vaccine have come with flu, but they have less severe symptoms as compared to unvaccinated people.
So vaccines remain one of the most important tools that we have. Dr. Tina Chopra is a professor of infectious diseases at Wayne State University. Dr. Chopra is also an expert with the Center for Emerging and Infectious Diseases. Thank you so much for taking the time with us today, Dr. Chopra.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
From the WDET newsroom, the CDC says about 1 in 4 Michigan residents have gotten a flu shot since the vaccine came out last fall. The health agency says flu activity in the state is high right now. State budget analysts say the governor and Michigan lawmakers will have almost $33 billion in revenue to work with this year, but they warn the Trump administration's new economic policies could affect that estimate.
Coming up at 11, home prices surged during the COVID pandemic and haven't come down. And this has made younger generations view home ownership differently. We're going to talk about home ownership in Detroit and across America, and we want to know what you think. What's your housing situation? Do you rent? Do you own? Has buying a home always been a goal of yours? And does it feel like it's attainable? Why or why not? Call us 313-577-1019.
Up next, lots of people in Detroit saw flooding in their homes. The city's aging infrastructure is a big culprit, but there's a change afoot. We'll learn more. We'll be right back on the Metro. Stay right there.
Welcome back to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. In August of 2023, historic rainfall and aging infrastructure left thousands of Metro Detroit basements flooded and backed up with stormwater and sewer water. 5,000 of those homes were in Detroit. Wayne County was one of the 9 counties in Michigan to receive emergency designation from FEMA. This meant affected residents could apply for federal aid to repair the damage, but not the city of Detroit. So what happens when the next historic rain event happens? Is it even possible to prevent flooding in a historic rain event without rebuilding the city's infrastructure entirely? With a newly announced federal grant, Robin, the city will have so much needed cash to address future flooding.
Yeah, Tia, that's a lot of necessary money. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has awarded the city of Detroit $346 million to prevent basement flooding. Mayor Duggan says some of the grant money will be used to repair collapsed alley drains, old sewer infrastructure that leads to backups in people's basements. Detroit also plans to build flood-resistant, affordable housing to make the city more resilient in future flooding events. Here to talk about why Detroit homes are vulnerable to flooding and what homeowners can expect in the future is Nick Schreck, professor of environmental law and interim dean of the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. Professor Schreck, thanks for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you for having me.
So first off, what is a block grant?
Well, so these are grants that are from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And really, it's just a large grant program that provides funds to, in this case, the city of Detroit to address these significant infrastructure concerns. But these are grants that are made regularly across the country to, it could be to states, could be to local municipalities. So Detroit, we received the largest amount of funding from this program in the state of Michigan. And that's because that flooding event that you mentioned in the intro, 5,000 of the homes that were impacted in that event were right here in the city of Detroit. So this is basically money, coming back, taxpayer money coming back here to the city of Detroit to address some of these infrastructure issues.
So during a rain event like that, which was quite cataclysmic, 5 inches of rain fell within a 6-hour period with near endless rain for several days after. And that rainfall has been referred to as historic. Mm-hmm. What makes a rain event historic in the age of climate change and extreme weather?
Well, that definition is changing all the time, as you mentioned. I mean, the thing about climate change, global warming, it really just leads to a lot of strange anomalies. For instance, right now in the winter, we're experiencing some cold weather snaps with Arctic air that's coming into our region because the jet stream is moving around a lot more than it used to because of changing ocean currents and that type of thing. And I mention that just to say that changing jet stream, the prevailing weather currents that come through our region, that has altered climate patterns, and that means we now get these rain events in the summer when the air is warmer. It can hold more moisture, and so you just get these deluges that are happening with more frequency. So historic events, we used to talk about these 100-year flood events, and that's basically just the percentage of a likelihood that you would have a storm within a 100-year period. All of those maps and all of those data sets are being redeveloped because we're seeing more intense rainstorms on a more regular basis. So what would have been a 100-year storm event 20 years ago is now shifting. We've now had 2 storms in the last 10 years that have exceeded 4 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, and that leads to significant flooding here in the city of Detroit. The system was designed to be able to handle about 3 to 4 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, but we've exceeded that, and we see these significant problems with basements backing up, streets flooding, that type of thing. Those flooding events here in our city are compounded by our infrastructure that is old and has many significant maintenance issues. And also, the mayor pointed out in the announcement for this grant, this system was designed for about 2 million residents, our sewer system. We now have about 700,000 people living in the city of Detroit. So thinking about maintaining that, sewers are expensive, right? We have to pay for that resource. And with fewer people paying into the system, that just means that we've had some deferred maintenance and problems that have cascaded over time. Hopefully this grant will be able to address some of those maintenance issues and then reduce these flooding events in the future, because they're coming with more frequency. With a warming climate, that means more rain, that means more intense rain. So we have to prepare for it, or else we're going to continue to have these problems like basement backup, street flooding, that type of thing.
Right. And you can't attract people to the city unless there's sound infrastructure. The way Metro Detroit is built, we have a lot of concrete.
Right.
We are the Motor City. Oftentimes fixing the roads means adding more lanes as well. What does all that concrete and asphalt do to our system when we have a major rain event?
Yeah, going back to pre-European settlement here in the city of Detroit, this was an area that was just full of wetlands, and we had a lot of creeks and rivers flowing through the city, most of which have been paved over or turned into sewer systems. In addition to all that concrete, we have here in Detroit what's called a combined sewer system. That means that our storm drains, so the drains you see on the side of the road, those are connected to our sanitary sewer. So that means all of the waste that goes down the drain when we flush our toilet, that's connected to these storm drains when we have rain events and melting snow at the street level. So when you have a big rainstorm, all that stuff gets combined together, and the system can't hold it all back, and it either has to go somewhere, right? So either it's going to back up into people's basements and into businesses, or it's going to get discharged into the Detroit and Rouge rivers. All of that concrete, all of that pavement, that means that there's no way for the water, when it's raining down, to naturally absorb and percolate into the ground. It has to go somewhere. And so it gets diverted into our sewer system. And when there's too much rain, too much volume, the system can't deal with it, and it has to go somewhere, right? All that pressure needs to be released. And either we're hopefully partially treating it, screening it a little bit before it gets discharged into the Detroit River, or it's going to back up into our system. So you just really need to have there's a lot of math and engineering that goes into designing the size of these systems based on things like the amount of concrete we have, the amount of pavement, the amount of roofs that we have that drain into the system. One thing I'll point out, in Detroit, we have a green stormwater program where we're trying to eliminate the amount of concrete, and so now there's taxes associated with the amount of that impervious or the concrete or pavement surfaces that we have, parking lots, that type of thing. And the plan is by taxing that parking lot, there's an incentive to try and reduce the amount of that hard surface that we have to allow, again, rain to naturally absorb into the ground. So you'll hear things like, green infrastructure, things like bioswales and green retention areas, all of that. That's where we need to be going in the future to reduce the amount of rain going into the sewer system when we have these large rain events.
Could you quickly define what green infrastructure is?
Yeah, great question. So what we're talking about there is trying to get back more to these natural systems. So if you think about a wetland, which is really like a marshy area, you might see cattails and other aquatic plants, that type of thing. Again, back before we paved over everything, you had these natural systems that were like sponges in the ground, right? So a marshy area that absorbs some of that rainwater, naturally filters through the soil, filters through the subsurface as well, and gets down into our water table. It turns into groundwater. So green infrastructure is trying to mimic those natural systems. You would divert rainwater off of the highway into a open space where you might have a temporary pond, really, right? An area that looks like a marsh area, and then that water naturally drains through the soil, and that's what we call a green program. That would also allow for habitat for things like migratory birds, things like our wildlife around here in the community. And so trying to get back to those systems is really where we need to go. It's you do have to maintain them, right? You do have to have some money set aside to maintain green infrastructure, but it's a lot less maintenance and expense than building pipes below the ground or building large storage containers underneath the ground, which has been what we call gray infrastructure, and that was the traditional approach to stormwater and sewage management, going back for 100 years. So it's really a shift in thinking, trying to go back to these natural systems that work very well to control flooding, to help filter pollutants out of the stormwater before it gets into our drinking water system. That's really where we need to be going, but that takes a lot of space. So one approach that we'll see in this grant that the city just received, there's some planning there looking at resilient communities, greener housing opportunities, affordable housing opportunities that will include these green infrastructure things like I'm talking about. So instead of just having a concrete parking lot, you'll want some areas within that parking lot where water can drain, fill into a green space. Again, you might see plantings and that type of thing that are there to divert that water and let it naturally absorb into the ground.
You're listening to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. We're talking about basement flooding in Detroit. The city was just awarded a block grant of $346 million to prevent future flooding, some of which will go towards repairing old infrastructure and some of which will go towards building new flood-resistant affordable housing. Our guest is Nick Schreck, professor of environmental law. Now, Nick, $346 million to prevent flooding sounds like a lot of money. But in terms of infrastructure and repair and upgrades, how far can $346 million go?
It is a lot of money, but you're right. This is expensive work. So anytime you're having to bring in, heavy equipment to, dig down below ground to open up some of these sewer systems and replace pipes and that type of thing. Also, a lot of this money will go towards cleaning out alley drains, and so the sewers in back alleys. And many of these have not had maintenance for decades, and so it's expensive to get the equipment in there. You think about like a plumber coming to your house to snake a drain if you have a clog in your shower or something like that. This is just on a much more massive scale where you have to have big equipment going through snaking these big sewer pipes, right? Which some of them are feet in diameter. So really big pieces of infrastructure that need to be cleaned, removing debris, tree roots and things that grow in between the joints in the sewer pipes over time. So it costs a lot of money. The hope is that in the thousands number of these alley drains will be cleared and repaired as part of this program. So a large portion of that $300 some million will go towards that maintenance of these back alley drains. If you don't have those maintained and there isn't anywhere for that water to go when we have these significant rain events, it will back up into homes, or it will back up into streets and flood streets. So it is a really important part of the system, having these open to allow that water to flow downhill. I mean, the whole idea with these systems is that you pitch the pipes so that water drains from our toilets or from the streets and then flows towards the wastewater treatment plant in Southwest Detroit, where it can be handled, treated, and then ultimately discharged with much less pollution getting into the Detroit River. And so you have to have all of those things directed, pitched towards the river, basically. And if you have any backages or stop-ups in those systems, it all can kind of fall apart pretty quickly, and that's where this money will go.
Fatbergs. I'm thinking about the. My goodness, they're gross. But before we're getting down to the wire here, so what can residents do with their own homes or their streets? We're talking about those fatbergs in their neighborhoods to reduce or prevent flooding, like they saw in August of 2023.
So a couple important things. One is checking the drains outside on the street. So if there's leaves or sticks or things that are blocking up any of the drains, then water can't get in there and you'll see backups on the street. Also disconnecting any downspouts. So if your downspouts are still connected to the sewer, those should be disconnected and divert that water into your yard. Or even better, get a rain barrel attached to your downspout where you can collect that water and then use it to water plants, your backyard garden, that type of thing. Also trying to remove the amount of hard surfaces in your own yard. So perhaps if you have a patio that's all made out of concrete, maybe switching that out into pavers so that the water can percolate down in more naturally. Putting in some more plants, native plants in our backyards that can absorb some of this rain, and tree planting too. This is a big thing. Having a tree canopy, trees that can, grab some of that groundwater, put it to good use rather than having it, back up into our basements. So all of those types of things. And then it's about fatbergs. This is, where there's oils and fats and things that go down the drain and collect in our sewer system. Also things like wipes, like Clorox wipes, please never flush those down the drain. They're not designed for that. Those need to be thrown away separately. So be really careful about what you put down the drain. I mean, a lot of things we just have to make sure that we're not putting into the system because they cause all sorts of problems. So trying to be vigilant, reading labels. A lot of like household cleaning products and things should not be put down the drain. They should be disposed of at a hazardous waste drop-off center because all of that can damage our sewer system and can then damage our environment.
I mean, I'm just thinking about so many different things that can go down a drain, not just the things that you talked about. Also,
right.
Toys. Watch your kids with the toys. Nick Schreck is a professor of environmental law and interim dean of the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. Professor Schreck, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you for having me.
This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.
Welcome back to the second hour of the Metro, when we dive deeper into the news and culture that shape our lives. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Tia, when we spoke about New Year's resolutions last week, and you can listen to that episode on WDET.org, I shared how I want to continue meditating in the mornings and using that time to think about how I want my life to look. And I do something that's called a perfect day meditation, and I learned it from this neuroscientist named Dr. Martha Beck. Do you ever do anything like that for yourself?
I do indeed. I make sure to just tell myself that today's going to be a good day. Yesterday is in the past and today is now. So we're going to be great today. And if it doesn't work out, we're going to try tomorrow,
Okay, all right.
Try tomorrow.
So you do some affirmations.
I definitely do affirmations in the morning, a little music as well. But what about you, our listener? Do you think about your perfect life? If you do, what does your dream life look like? Are you career-minded? You put your passion into your work and it's an extension of who you are? Or maybe you envision a big family, biological or chosen, and your free time you spent at sports, games, or volunteering at their school. Could it be that you yearn to spend your days traveling the world, or perhaps you felt you've been called to be a service? We all have different expectations and standards for what makes life worth living, but we are often reminded at some point in our lives that achieving financial stability should be at or near the top of that list.
Yeah, Tia, we get reminded of that a lot here in the U.S. And then that's tied with this idea that this is the land of opportunity, where you can find a pair of proverbial bootstraps. But how hard are those boots to find today? That's the question. Today, we want to take a closer look at what material those bootstraps are made of, in addition to how easy they are to find. Are they really strong enough to lift people out of every situation? For generations, owning a home has been a symbol of achievement in this country. It's the most common way to accumulate health, but Home prices surged during the pandemic. They haven't come down, and it's made younger generations look at home ownership differently. In other words, it's made some of us feel like it's out of reach. According to the Harris poll, 60% of Americans don't believe home ownership is worth the return on investment it once was, and that renting might be their preferred way to live. We want to know what you think. What's your housing situation? Do you rent or own? Has buying a home always been a goal of yours? Tell us why. Call us at 313-577-1019. Now, I am a renter. Tia, you're a renter.
Yes.
So we've brought a homeowner into the studio. Senior producer David Lyons. Dave, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Glad to join you.
So how long have you owned a home?
Since 2018.
Okay, and what was your path to purchasing it? What did that look like? Was it a treacherous one?
Well, the last moments of actually getting a loan were a lot easier than I thought, and that was always the biggest thing that I was afraid of because I'd never really had any cash, and I thought, man, it's going to be completely unaffordable. I'm never going to be able to afford a home because whatever that sticker price is, $100,000, $200,000, people pay $300,000 for their houses or more. It just seemed like I'm never going to make anywhere near that amount of money. How could I ever afford this? But it turns out I was lucky. The time that I purchased the home was low interest. There was low interest rates available. So I had worked my first good full-time job, not several part-time minimum wage jobs. It took a while because I'm a millennial and I graduated high school in 2007, which meant things were rough for a minute.
Yep.
So once I finally got that first full-time job, I buckled down for 1 year. Saved up as much as I could, which wasn't that much really, and I put down the bare minimum for an interest or for a down payment, and that was the hardest hurdle.
Off topic really quickly, because you graduated in 2007 from high school, which was when we started to see the height of that recession. It was in our faces everywhere all the time. We're starting to see, the news stories. We're seeing people's homes, people losing their homes. You're 18, you're a young man, you're going into college and beyond. What were your thoughts at that moment in time when you're seeing that coming out of high school?
Honestly, I never thought I would own a home.
Yeah.
I never thought I didn't think it was attainable, which it sounds kind of like that feeling has come back around for people because we feel that when economic challenges are coming across the country and costs are really high. But yeah, I didn't think I would ever be able to own a home. So it took, 10 years or so, at least from the time I was like, it would be nice. I rented all over the place and had all kinds of experiences there. It wasn't great. So I was looking forward to getting a house so I could stop dealing with landlords and places that were falling apart and all that.
What are some of the benefits that you would say you've noticed most, the contrasts even from renting and having this idea that you would never be able to own a home to having one today?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the stability. Some people look at it as being tied down, which I'll just say you can always sell your house at some point. So
Sure.
Just like you got to move and find a new place to rent, you could always sell your house. There's a bunch of details that are probably in
Or
there.
rent it.
Or rent it out. I've never sold a house and I've never rented a house out, but I know those are options that people often use. But what I've really benefited from is just the stability and knowing that my house is what it is every day. I do know that at some point my AC or my furnace will break because they're both super old and I have not had to replace them yet, and I've been waiting for that to happen. But at least I know what to expect, and I just feel like when I was renting, so many things would happen, and you got to wait for the landlord to call a repairman who's probably not very good and doesn't even know what they're doing to do a shoddy job. And, that stuff just got on my nerves. I enjoy painting my house. I like to learn how to fix stuff. I'm not really handy, but I'm trying to learn each step of the way. So I've enjoyed that part of it. It's nice to be able to put a nail in the wall wherever you want and not get $500 security deposit charge.
Speaking to the choir right now.
I'm feeling
to the choir.
seen right now. I just
yeah.
moved out of a place and I had to spend quite a bit of time patching up all those holes.
Yeah.
Tia, what about you? Is owning a home on your wish list, my fellow renter?
Yes, it is on my wish list. It's on my wish list because I grew up with family members, of course, those who had their own space. And I grew up with family members who had large spaces of land and farms and wild animals. So, yes, I would love to own my own space, my own home, my own land, so I can do my own thing. If I want to have my girls with me, a.k.a. my chickens, I'm going to have my girls with me. You know, those are the reasons why I want to buy a home, especially in Detroit now with the livestock ordinance. I can have my girls in my backyard. So I really am looking forward to one day being a homeowner. I think it is feasible for myself. I know it's going to be hard, but you know, it's feasible. It's something that I can do.
You can do it. And I'll also just throw out there, I did have chickens when I was renting.
Did you? Oh,
it didn't end well because
you don't have to wait, Tia.
The city told us you can't do that. So that didn't end well. But it was for a while. We had some eggs. That was cool. But yeah, that was one of those things. I don't have chickens now. I live in Dearborn. I don't think we can have chickens.
I think
maybe, but I don't think I can manage that kind of maintenance. That sounds hard.
Chickens and babies, human babies.
Yeah, it's enough. I got a dog. It's cool.
Yeah, I was gonna say she can help.
Yeah. No, I would love. I share your dream.
Okay.
I share your dream. Absolutely. Just not in the home I have and the yard I have. There's enough yard maintenance, which, you know, we were talking about storm water infrastructure and green infrastructure. You know, I think one of my favorite things, honestly, is I like to go out and just walk around the yard and like look at stuff as it grows throughout the year, and I can plant things and like wait to see what happens next year and what happens after that. And I can grow some food. I have just enough space to appreciate things growing and appreciate the seasons, which is just something I enjoy doing. So that's something I really appreciate, is having a little bit of green space outside that I know is mine.
I love that. And Robin, we've talked a little bit about you as well. You've been on the West Coast. You've been in different spaces. You've been, I guess, Northwest as well, part of the country. So about being here in the city of Detroit, do you see yourself being a homeowner one day?
Yeah, I was reluctant. I couldn't really think about home ownership in the places that I was living previously, because in Jackson, Wyoming, where I was for more than a decade, the median price for a home was $1 million. So it was completely unattainable there. In Colorado, in Denver, what I would get there for what I could afford just made absolutely no sense at all. And it was a very, very sparse and competitive market. And here I'm feeling like I want to plant my roots deeper. And so that would mean home ownership. I just moved into a new apartment, and yesterday was the second plumbing emergency that I witnessed in as many months of being there.
Goodness.
So I'm feeling quite inspired.
But I don't want to pour cold plumbing water on your inspiration.
Too soon.
But just yesterday, I was helping my dad because his plumbing had an issue that he didn't know about, and we had to completely rip apart the entire kitchen and all the floors.
No.
Plumbing problems happen whether you own it or rent it, but it's whether you feel like you're ready to spend 12 hours on a random day, because you gotta. That's the thing that you gotta do. And as a renter, you're just like, it's someone else's problem. They're going to take forever to fix it. Homeowner, you're like, I like that responsibility. I'm ready to figure that out, or pay someone and just got the money. But, you know.
Yeah, you're a roll up your sleeve kind of guy. You're going to fix it if you can.
I mean, if you've ever demoed stuff, broken things apart, it feels good. Just sledgehammering stuff.
Yeah, just take it to the wall.
Oh, man, it's
just
fun. I was literally...
break that wall down.
I was hitting a wall with a hammer, and that feels good.
Raid rooms, man. We got to go to a raid room. Yeah.
All right. Well, we want to know what you think about home ownership. Is it still as essential to economic mobility as it once was? Call us at 313-577-1019.
Coming up on the Metro, we'll discuss the overall state of housing. We want to hear from you. When did you buy your home? How has buying a home always been, or has buying a home always been a goal of yours? And if you are looking to buy right now, would you buy a home in today's market? Give us a call, 313-577-1019. Stay with us on the Metro. We will be right back.
Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. Today we're talking about how difficult it has become to be in a better financial spot than generations prior. particularly when it comes to housing. Now that we have shared our desires to own land, we want to bring in Professor Thomas Sugrue into the conversation. Professor Sugrue is a historian and a Julius Silver Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and History at New York University. Professor Sugrue, welcome to the Metro.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so are you personally a homeowner?
I'm not. I moved to New York City after owning my own homes for more than 30 years, and now I am a renter.
And what has that been? What's the difference for you? You owned a home 30 years, 3 decades, and now you're renting. So what have you seen, pros, contrasts there?
Well, it has some upsides and some downsides. The real upside is I'm not responsible for maintenance anymore. I don't have to deal with plumbing leaks. I don't have to deal with repairing a roof. I don't have to deal with mowing the lawn and all the other things that come with owning your own home. And I lived in a big old house before I moved to New York, and it was pretty expensive to keep up year after year.
And, you know, Robin and myself, we're both renters as well. And one day we would like to purchase a home. This has been a goal for many generations of Americans. So, Professor Sugrue, when did we first begin to collectively chase home ownership?
We really began to focus on home ownership as a vehicle for upward mobility during the 1930s and the Great Depression, when the country had gone through a huge financial crisis and a housing shortage, and the federal government stepped in and provided supports for home buyers and for developers to construct affordable housing. And it made possible the dream of home ownership that had been pretty remote for many, many Americans, because they didn't have the money to put down on houses and they couldn't afford high interest mortgages.
And oftentimes, this is personally for myself, when I hear these type of programs that were put into place, especially government programs, I often think about this narrative that we have now in our society of pulling yourself up from your bootstraps, or not being helped, or not being given a handout. So I think about how this country had these type of things set in place and where we are today. Can you talk about that being set in place there in 1930s to where we are today?
Yeah, the idea that home ownership is about individual initiative and effort doesn't stand the test of reality. That is, without massive federal programs through the Federal Housing Administration, through the Homeowners Loan Corporation, through the Veterans Administration, most Americans, especially middle and working class Americans, no matter how hard they worked, wouldn't be able to afford their own homes. And so government stepped in and dramatically transformed the situation of housing in the United States. Pretty much everything in metropolitan Detroit, built after the Second World War, was made possible by these significant federal programs. It made possible widespread suburbanization. Although it should be said, those programs disadvantaged everybody except for whites. They were discriminatory in origin and in application.
And that's another point that I was going to talk about, was just the access to the homes and housing, especially when we talk about these programs in the 1930s and as we go on, being helped through the federal government. Who had access to the programs and how it based itself and how it showed itself throughout the country, which we will definitely get into in a little bit. But I do want to just hit on that just for a moment, just talking about the access there to those homes.
Those homes made it possible for white Americans to get access to affordable mortgages and home loans for home improvement. But federal programs explicitly discriminated against groups that they considered to be, quote, actuarially unsound or risky. And that included the vast majority of Americans of color, particularly African Americans. Those programs developed measures to determine whether a property or a house was risky or not, or a buyer was risky or not, through a system called redlining, which was essentially marking certain neighborhoods as undesirable or risky. And those neighborhoods included most Black people, most people of Latin American descent, and some other groups that were perceived as threatening, un-American, or marginal.
You're listening to the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We're talking with historian Thomas Sugrue about housing in America. Professor Sugrue, when we talk about redlining, can you just remind us how deep and lasting the impacts have been from that?
The impacts have been enormous and long-lasting. Programs that began in the 1930s and 1940s set the expectations for what is risky or not risky, set the expectations for where people live or don't live, and basically harden the patterns of residential segregation by race that are still very deeply entrenched in the United States. It's been 100 years of nearly of federal housing policy, yet we can still see high rates of segregation in most of our major metropolitan areas, of course, including Detroit.
What do you think needs to happen to remedy this legacy of historic discrimination in housing?
Well, the biggest consequence of that historic discrimination was limiting the availability of affordable housing in communities that had a lot of amenities, that had well-funded schools, that had good infrastructure. It confined people of color, in particular, to neighborhoods that were experiencing infrastructural collapse, where tax revenue was falling, where schools were struggling to meet the needs of their students, and allowed disproportionately white Americans to move to places that had lots of resources, to be able to hoard their opportunities, you might say, and in places that were segregated because of generations of housing policy, both federal and private housing policies.
How do you see that changing when we think about how more folks are now interested in moving into the city of Detroit? How can that potentially change these dynamics and the resources available to people who are living in underserved neighborhoods?
Well, that requires a reallocation of resources toward underserved neighborhoods. And a lot of the movement into Detroit is going to a relatively small section of the city that has a lot of resources and has seen a lot of new investment. On the other hand, large sections of the city, places that have been losing population and housing for decades, have not seen a huge influx of resources, either government resources or private investment that has created new housing opportunity. And that's a serious problem. It means that we see the patterns of inequality in our housing market being replicated, even as the city is now becoming a magnet for a segment of those who are looking for new houses.
So to that end, how important is it to really diversify the housing stock and to create more affordable housing that people truly want to live in?
Yeah, that's the nub of the problem. The United States has a massive housing affordability crisis. It's one that plays out pretty much everywhere, city, suburb, and rural areas even, where we simply don't have a big enough supply of good quality, affordable housing to meet the needs of Americans. Most of the new housing construction and most of the new investment has gone into housing for middle class and especially better off people. That includes both new housing construction and rental housing. We've got a lot of high-end rental housing springing up all over the country. We have new housing being built in Detroit for gentrifiers, for folks moving in from suburban places or other parts of the country. We have the conversion of old office buildings into high-end housing, but very little of that is affordable to the city's large middle class, much less working class and poor population. Nationwide, we're about a million housing units short of current demand, and that's in total. That's not even including affordable housing.
Professor Sugrue, I think about public housing in some European countries, for example, and this is housing where people truly want to live, where there are many amenities and things are kept up nicely. And it makes me think about the contrast, the stigma that public housing in the U.S. continues to have. Where did that stigma come from, and how do we chip away at that?
Yeah, well, I just took a trip in December to Vienna for a conference, the capital of Austria, a major world city, and more than 50% of Vienna's population lives in public housing. We're talking about a wealthy city and a pretty wealthy country that nonetheless provides lots of affordable housing options so that folks can spend their income on other essentials and even other luxuries. They can afford to live in what would otherwise be an extraordinarily expensive city. But the stigma against public housing in the United States almost goes back to the beginning. That is, the United States introduced public housing programs in the 1930s at the same time that it was subsidizing suburbanization and single-family home ownership among whites. And so the subsidies for single-family home ownership were massive compared to the amount of money that we put into public housing. By the 50s and 60s, public housing in much of the United States had become associated with African Americans and other non-white groups, and that stigmatization, places that were largely concentrated in segregated neighborhoods in cities, inhabited by mostly poor and working class people, led to a decline in popular support for continued subsidies for public housing. So since the late 60s and early 1970s, we've seen a dramatic decline in federal support for public housing and really a collapse. There are massive waiting lists for what little remains of public housing in our big cities because it met a need, just as it meets a need for people in Vienna and other cities around the world. But we simply don't have a big enough supply, and federal support for it has been has tanked out now for more than 50 years.
You're listening to The Metro on 101.9 WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. We are talking with historian Thomas Sugrue about housing in America. Give us a call. Are you a renter or an owner? Do you believe it's still part of the American dream to own a home? And how did buying a home change your life? 313-577-1019. The number is 313-577-1019. So let's talk a bit about Metro Detroit and white flight. How did housing policy lead to white flight from the city to the suburbs?
Housing policy, really beginning again with the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration, made it possible for hundreds of thousands of white households to move to new single-family detached housing, largely in Oakland County and Macomb County, places that underwent an extraordinary boom during the post-Second World War II years. On the other hand, it limited the opportunities of folks who were deemed risky, and it led to ultimately a withdrawal of investment and the lack of availability of conventional mortgages, of affordable mortgages in large parts of Detroit and in a handful of outlying areas that had significant non-white, poor, working class populations, places like, say, Inkster or Pontiac.
Yeah. And Thomas, oftentimes on the show, we talk about the historical challenges that the city of Detroit has faced. And we think about the rebellion of 67 that happened and that in the resulting decline in Detroit's population. Could you talk a little bit about 67, if you have this, of course, in your brain readily available, to talk about the 67 rebellion a little bit and what it did to Detroit's population, its housing, and some of the things, especially its appearance to the public?
67 brought out into the public eye a generation plus of simmering discontent at the marginalization of racism and discrimination in metropolitan Detroit. But it wasn't the primary cause of Detroit's population decline. Detroit had been losing population since the early 1950s pretty steadily. And it was losing that population because the auto industry was decentralizing, moving new plants and operations to suburban areas, to rural areas, to other parts of the country. And Detroit was losing population because of that massive subsidization of white suburbanization. The construction of highways, also underwritten by massive infusions of federal dollars, made it possible for folks to leave the city and really, in some ways, not look back at the city except through their rearview mirrors. And that division between city and suburb is a characteristic feature of Detroit and also of many metropolitan areas in the United States, of hostility and suspicion, worsened by the fact that there's really pronounced segregation. There have been recently, of course, the movement of African Americans into some of Detroit's surrounding suburbs, places like East Point and Southfield, Redford. But by and large, those patterns of suburbanization are replicating the old history of segregation. That is, as black folks move in, white folks leave. And as a consequence, Detroit still remains one of the most racially segregated areas in the United States.
Yes, and it's very stark when you are here and you see it. When we're seeing an interesting trend like you just talked about in Southeast Michigan, like you said, when the black folks move in, the white folks tend to move out. And that's what's happening right now. The suburbs are getting less white and white people are moving back into the city. What do we make of this? How are we tracking and following this?
Well, it is noteworthy that white people are moving back into the city, but the numbers are pretty small. The vast majority of whites in metropolitan Detroit are not moving to the city. They're moving further out into the suburban periphery. That said, the movement of whites into certain parts of the city, downtown and then the neighborhoods immediately surrounding it mostly, has led to growing investment in the kinds of businesses and infrastructure that serve a wealthier population. Detroit has more good restaurants than it did 30 or 40 years ago. It's got an increasingly vibrant arts and culture scene. But we make an assumption that that kind of reinvestment in the city or the movement of whites in the city is going to have what I would call trickle-down effects to the rest of the population. And there's not much of a sign that the majority of residents of Detroit who are not rich, who are not white, and who are living in neighborhoods that haven't seen a lot of investment or gentrification are really benefiting. The movement of whites in hasn't created a lot of new well-paying jobs. It hasn't dramatically increased the city's tax base. And so while it's a change, and while it is noteworthy that Detroit is more diverse than it was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, it's still not a panacea for the deep inequality and the economic troubles that still afflict the city.
And Thomas, I love that you talked about that a little bit there, because there is this idea, once again, that we're seeing a lot more white people moving into the city of Detroit than you just said is actually happening. So when we look at the landscape of the city of Detroit right now in terms of who's moving in, who's moving out, population flows, and how how things are moving in the city, what are you seeing right now? What are we all seeing right now? So we can just really kind of lay it to rest a little bit.
Yeah, well, Detroit is still an overwhelmingly black city, and Metro Detroit is still highly segregated by race. So while we see highly educated whites, younger whites especially, being attracted to the city, it's a part of a back to the city wave that many, many American places have experienced in the last 20 or 30 years. It's not the whole story. We focus on it because it's new, right? It's exciting to some folks to see a reversal of a long-time pattern of white flight. But again, we need to look at the whole metropolitan area, which is an area of several million people, and most whites are continuing to live on the suburban periphery, and the patterns of the inequitable distribution of jobs and resources haven't been solved by the movement of folks into the city.
And over the last 15 to 20 years, Detroit has faced a housing market crash, a recession that cost many residents their homes. Then a few years ago, we learned that the city overassessed property tax rates, which created an even greater financial strain on homeowners. Now we are seeing skyrocketing costs for homes across the nation. Is home ownership viewed in the same way today as it was when the New Deal was implemented?
Definitely not. I mean, Detroit experienced a Great Depression-like wave of foreclosures beginning in the first decade of the 2000s, even before the crash in 2008. And that meant that for a lot of people, homeownership started to look pretty shaky. Now we have record high interest rates, at least record high for the last 30 years. We have a real shortage of good quality and affordable housing. And a real small supply of existing houses available for sale on the market. A lot of folks who have the good fortune of buying houses and getting mortgages on them when interest rates were low are hanging on. They're not letting go of their houses because ultimately it would cost them to get new higher interest rates and move elsewhere. Why not stick with a low cost? And that means that people who are looking to buy have seriously limited options in the current market. And the rental market isn't really making up the gap. A lot of people in Metro Detroit and nationwide are renters, but the supply of affordable, good quality rental stock is also really low. And often rental prices rental properties are priced higher than what people can afford. About 50% of renters are what we call rent burdened or housing cost burdened. That is, they're spending more than 30% of their income just on housing costs. And a significant portion of renters are spending 50% or more on rental costs. So there aren't that many affordable options in the rental market either. But so both are facing a serious crisis right now. We lack decent housing for both people who are aspiring to own their own homes and people who don't want to or can't afford to.
And I'm one of those people who are rent burdened for sure. So last question before we let you go, is there anything that can be done to fix housing costs at the federal level right now?
Yes, but I'm not very optimistic at the moment because of the shift in political power in Washington, where there's very little interest in addressing the affordable housing crisis. Our new president is, you might say, America's real estate developer in chief, and his fortune was built largely on building high cost real estate. There's not much interest in Washington right now of expanding affordable housing. Certainly not in expanding subsidies for renters or for buyers. And so I'm not particularly optimistic. What we need is a federal policy that recognizes that everyone's lives will be improved if we have more affordable housing in the United States. That keeping subsidies going to high-end housing and starving people of affordable housing only contributes to economic insecurity. It contributes to homelessness. It contributes to people doubling up or tripling up. But one last thing to say is that there's a lot of action that states and localities can do. So in some parts of the country, say, for example, in California, local governments are encouraging and providing subsidies for the construction of what we call accessory housing, which is taking a big property and building an additional apartment or building another building on the lot as a way of meeting pressing needs for affordable housing. Sometimes we call them, grandma apartments or rear buildings. And these kinds of changes to zoning laws are never going to be accomplished by the federal government, but they can be accomplished by city governments, by state governments, by counties, depending on what part of the country we're in. In other words, we need to think creatively about expanding the options for people who want to buy or rent who don't have a lot of income. And thus far, we haven't done a very good job.
Professor Thomas Sugrue is a historian and a Julius Silver Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and History at New York University. Professor Sugrue, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you.
This is the Metro on WDET. So we've looked at what's gotten us to this current state of affairs with housing. Coming up, we'll examine what that means for potential home buyers today. And we want to hear from you. Is your neighborhood getting more or less diverse? Call and tell us about what you're seeing. The number is 313-577-1019. Stay with us on the Metro. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We're talking about housing accessibility in the U.S., and we want to look at housing dynamics today in Detroit. The city has gone through so many notable financial struggles, all of which have hit Detroit residents in tough ways. Joining us now to discuss the state of housing here is Anika Goss. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Detroit Future City. Anika, thanks for joining us on the Metro.
Well, thanks for having me.
Of course.
So how many residents own homes in Detroit today compared to the period before the recession?
It's
very specific.
Right. Detroit, okay, so I'm going to have to recall that. But right now, about 51% of Detroiters are homeowners. It really changes from year over year between renters and homeowners. But right now, we are we're just tipping over a majority. I would say the last number that I recall, at one time, Detroit was as high as a 70% homeownership.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a city of neighborhoods, right? It's a city of neighborhoods. It's a city of single family homes. And so, Detroiters owned their homes. And it was really the foreclosure crisis, the mortgage foreclosure crisis, and then on top of that, the tax foreclosure crisis that probably did the most damage to our homeownership. And then in 2016, for the first time, Detroit became a majority renter city. And that was sort of the beginning of how we think about renters versus owners. Now, I think it's really important to note there are a lot of major cities that are not majority homeowner cities.
That's right. And
there's a stigma that we have to renting that we need to really reconsider, because there are now, I think that there's a difference. Being a renter, there are a lot of people that end up owning that probably should be renting, right? To just prepare them to own, because there are a lot more costs than just the cost of the home itself.
Sure,
that
all
goes
the
into
unforeseen
ownership.
Circumstances.
Absolutely, the maintenance costs, taxes, all of that. But at the same time, trying to find and trying to create pathways for long-term renters so that people who are renting, for 5 years, 10 years, there are a lot of people who rent like that. They should probably be owners at this point. One of the things, Detroit Future City, we recently produced a mortgage report. Every couple of years, we're analyzing the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, and all of the financial institutions are required to submit their mortgage numbers to this data center. And what we've seen for Detroit is that Black homeownership is actually on the rise in Detroit, and that is really, really good news.
Yep.
And should be celebrated. And so I feel like that's something to think about. But on the other hand, we're also seeing rents at a much higher rate than they've been at a really long time, which is also very concerning.
I think about that rents are not commensurate with the amenities available in the city of Detroit. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could characterize the renting landscape in terms of the quality of housing that's even available.
Yeah. One thing that we're in paying attention to rental, one thing to keep in mind is only about 26% of rental units in Detroit are subsidized rental units. And this is really important because it doesn't mean that the other 75% are high-end rental units. It just means that 25% are the only units that have some federal restrictions, that have some federal accountability, where they have inspectors coming in to determine that this is stable, quality, affordable housing. The rest of them, you're really, sort of renting and at the mercy of that property owner.
It's the Wild West.
Yeah, and if that property owner isn't a great property owner and they're not registered on the city's rental registry, you could end up renting from a bad actor. And they're not, and I'm not saying they're all bad actors, because there's some really good, really small property owners, like someone who buys the house next to them, fixes it up, rents it out to someone, a family member, a neighbor. That also happens, and that's a great opportunity. But there are a lot more. At least when we did, according to our research that we did in partnership with Data Driven Detroit a few years ago, the majority of owners in Detroit, the majority of the properties are owned by a few large property owners, and those property owners, they may or may not be great.
Does that explain this drastic rise in rent prices?
Yes.
Because it seems, I was just searching for a home to rent an apartment, and it felt like the market was flooded with options. And so it didn't seem to make sense to me why the prices sat where they did.
Yeah, it's completely unregulated. Even, I have a 25-year-old son. It's his birthday today.
Happy birthday.
Shout out to James.
Happy birthday, James.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, thank you. He's at work, so I don't know if he's listening today. But anyway.
James, you better be listening.
I know. What are you doing?
Yeah, so... but he had to move outside of the city, and that was really disappointing for him. Yeah. Once he could afford his own place, that he is living in Dearborn. And where he's living in Dearborn, the rent has already gone up. It's really, really expensive, and he has trouble even affording that. So it's very unregulated, unlike other places that have been renter cities for a long time, where there's a lot of regulation about rental rates and fixed rate pricing and the relationship between landlords and tenants.
You're listening to the Metro on 101.9 WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. We're talking with Detroit Future City CEO Anika Goss about how the high cost of housing across America is affecting Detroit. You talked a little bit about it, how it's kind of like these prices are set kind of wonky, but can you talk about it a little bit more, affordable housing prices, or how they're set? The city bases affordable housing costs on the area median income, or AMI, but Detroit's AMI includes surrounding cities that have residents with higher incomes. This raises the prices of the homes above what's actually affordable for people who live here. So are there alternative ways to determine rental prices to better meet the needs of Detroit residents?
So I think there's a couple of things that are happening here. One, the AMI. So the AMI is a HUD regulated calculation, right, where they're determining the area median income. So it's not that Detroit is doing this, right? This is just
federal
based
government.
Exactly. And so every city across the country uses the area median income. And that not only determines affordable housing, but it also determines market. So whatever is considered market rate. Detroit has housing that would be considered naturally occurring for affordable housing without any other subsidy, because the either the comparables are so low, housing is set in an area where there are no mortgages, or there haven't been mortgages in a long time, or there's so few mortgages, it's hard to actually determine the real value of a home. So all of that goes into it. So it's not just the area median income; it's also a valuation factor. So that's why you see some. I was looking on Zillow just yesterday, and there's some homes that are still like $30,000. You could still get a $25,000 home on Mark Twain, for example, right? And that is because in that area there are so few comparables, and there haven't been any new mortgages to set a higher value. Okay. Yeah. Now, the rent is different. You can set the rent based on the average rent for an entire area. So that may not be, it's not connected to home ownership and valuation of home ownership in the same way.
It makes so much sense why these apartments are so expensive now.
Yeah.
So are we starting to see, you talked about it a little bit more, but you talked about how we're starting to see mortgages, more Black holders of mortgages in the city of Detroit. So talk about how, especially as you're talking about now buying a home for your neighbor and how that looks good for your community. Can you talk about what this says about Detroit's health, especially housing?
Yeah. So we just seen, and it's been like the last 2 years, this slow uptick. And this last, the 2023 HMDA data showed that Black home buyers, Black homeowners are outpacing white and any other ethnic group for small mortgages, which is really, really good for Detroit, right? So these are mortgages between $75,000 and $150,000. This is a very modest number in the larger scheme of things, and I don't want us to rest on our laurels here, right? Because what's also is the difference between white mortgages is also much higher. So where there are white mortgages, those are averaging around $250,000. So that's a separate issue. However, we are seeing more Black homeowners and more, which creates more opportunity, because that's really how you build your wealth. So maybe your starter home is only $100,000, but your next home, because you have this as an asset in 5 years or however long you live there, will be for that $250,000 home.
Anika Goss is the CEO of Detroit Future City. Anika, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro. We will definitely talk with you so much more throughout the year.
Oh, thank you for having me.
That's the Metro for January 13th, 2025. This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.
Have a good day.